When we hear the word energy, many of us picture something abstract, maybe a spiritual aura, a mystical force, or something that lives outside the realm of science. But that's a misconception. Energy, in the context of the human experience, is not abstract. It's measurable, it's observable, and most importantly, it's trainable. At its core, every single process in the human body, from the firing of a neuron to the contraction of a muscle to the rise and fall of your mood, is driven by biophysics and biochemistry. These aren't metaphors, they're facts. The brain operates using electrochemical gradients, meaning it communicates through energy. Actual voltage changes across neural membranes. Every thought you have, every decision you make, every moment of clarity or confusion, it's all a product of ions moving across membranes, of neurons firing, of neurotransmitters binding to receptors. That's not philosophy, that's physics. Let's take a deeper look. The basic unit of the nervous system is the neuron. Neurons don't think, they transmit signals. Those signals are based on the movement of sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride ions. When enough positive charge builds up in a neuron's cell body, it reaches what's called threshold potential, and then an action potential fires, a spike in voltage that travels down the axon to another neuron. That signal? That's energy. Electrical energy transformed into chemical signals at synapses, and then often back into electrical energy again. This cascade of energy is what allows you to see, hear, remember, plan, move, feel, and focus. The fuel for all of this is ATP, the energy currency of the cell. And ATP isn't limitless. It's produced through metabolic processes, especially in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, using nutrients from the food you eat and the oxygen you breathe. So yes, the clarity of your mind, the sharpness of your focus, and your capacity to handle stress or make decisions, all of it is downstream of energy production and usage at a cellular level. That's biology. Now here's where this becomes personal and trainable. Energy, and the way you access it, depends on the state of your autonomic nervous system. This is the part of your nervous system that regulates your internal state without your conscious control. It includes the sympathetic, fight or flight, and parasympathetic branches. These systems are in constant flux. When you're in a sympathetic state, your body mobilizes energy, your pupils dilate, your heart rate increases, your blood is shunted to your limbs. This is useful for taking action, but if it's left unchecked, it leads to burnout. Conversely, when you're in a parasympathetic state, you're calm, centered, and can recover, but too much of this without stimulation leads to apathy. Here's the key. Energy is not just what you have, it's how you manage the oscillation between these states. If you're always revving in high gear or always collapsed in low power mode, your system becomes dysregulated. You start mistaking noise for clarity, urgency for importance, and distraction for depth. When you learn to identify the signals of these systems, heart rate, pupil dilation, breathing patterns, even body posture, you begin to see that what we casually call energy is actually the sum total of your physiological readiness to perceive, decide, and act. And that readiness can be adjusted, regulated, and trained. Here's a powerful example. Your visual system is intimately tied to your autonomic state. When you're stressed or alert, your vision narrows, a result of sympathetic activation. But when you deliberately widen your gaze, you signal to the brainstem that you're safe, and it begins to shift you toward a more balanced parasympathetic state. That's a conscious, mechanical shift that changes your energy, not in some vague way, but in a direct, observable way in the nervous system. The same goes for breath. Fast, shallow breathing stimulates sympathetic tone. Deep, slow exhalations activate the vagus nerve, shifting you into parasympathetic recovery. This isn't mood manipulation. It's energetic rebalancing through biology. Even your thoughts have a measurable energetic impact. Rumination and negative thought loops activate the default mode network. a system in the brain associated with introspection and often anxiety. In contrast, task-so-focused thinking, which requires prefrontal cortex activation, organizes mental energy toward forward motion. You can literally redirect neural energy by what you pay attention to. So when someone says, I'm drained, I'm scattered, or I feel stuck, they're not speaking metaphorically. They're describing the actual energetic state of their nervous system. And that's a system you can train through light exposure, movement, breath work, nutrition, sleep optimization, and focus training. You build a nervous system that doesn't just generate more energy, it learns to use it efficiently, purposefully, and with clarity. Clarity is often misunderstood. People tend to treat it as if it's a trait, something you're either born with or not. Some believe that certain individuals are naturally decisive, focused, and calm under pressure, while others are destined to operate in confusion and overwhelm. But that's incorrect. Clarity is not a gift. It's a physiological capacity that you can train, just like strength, endurance, or flexibility. To understand clarity, you first have to understand how your nervous system works. Every experience you have is filtered through it. It's your interface with reality. The brain doesn't passively receive information. It selects it, filters it, and prioritizes it based on your internal state. What you call clarity is really your ability to regulate the noise and amplify the signal neurologically. Let's get precise. Clarity is the result of prefrontal cortex activation in a state of autonomic balance. The prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, focus, impulse control, and decision-making. But this part of the brain only comes fully online when your nervous system is in a regulated, alert, but calm state. If you're too anxious, too stressed, or too fatigued, the prefrontal cortex gets overridden by subcortical areas like the amygdala and hypothalamus, regions built for reflex and survival, not nuanced thinking. So when someone says they can't think straight or they're in a fog, that's not metaphorical. That's real. Their nervous system is dysregulated. Cortisol is elevated, adrenaline may be flooding the system, and blood flow is reduced in the very brain areas needed for clarity. In that moment, clarity isn't available, not because of a personality flaw, but because of a biological bottleneck. The good news is that you can change this. You can train your nervous system to recognize when it's off balance and to bring it back to a state of high-performing awareness. One of the fastest ways to do this is through the mechanics of the body: breath, vision, posture, and movement. Because those systems feed directly back into the brainstem and autonomic centers that control your internal state. Here's a practical example. Rapid, shallow breathing increases sympathetic arousal, useful in short bursts, but detrimental to long-term focus. In contrast, deep breathing with slow exhales triggers parasympathetic activation, calming the nervous system. By deliberately slowing your breath and lengthening the exhale, you can shift your internal state from reactive to responsive. That change isn't mental, it's neurological, and it sets the stage for clarity. Another entry point is vision. When you engage in panoramic vision, that is widening your field of view to take in the periphery, you reduce activity in areas of the brain associated with threat detection and stress. You literally quiet the parts of the brain that scream danger and activate the areas that support focus, presence, and planning. Again, not metaphor, mechanism. Posture and movement matter too. When your body is collapsed, hunched, or frozen, it sends a signal to your brain that something is wrong. This engages the stress response. But upright posture and rhythmic movement, walking, for example, send safety signals to the nervous system. That allows cognitive resources to be reallocated towards strategic thinking and attention. Sleep and light exposure are also massive levers for clarity. The circadian system, which governs sleep-wake cycles, alertness, hormone release, is tightly coupled to nervous system regulation. Poor sleep leads to impaired glucose metabolism in the brain and reduced activation of the prefrontal cortex. Without sleep, you can't sustain clarity. Morning sunlight anchors your circadian rhythm, improving energy and cognitive function throughout the day. That light isn't just mood lifting, it's neurochemically stabilizing. Let's also talk about internal dialogue. Negative looping thoughts. I can't do this. I'm overwhelmed. This is too much. Aren't just mental habits. They're neural circuits that become stronger the more they're used. But you can rewire them through directed attention. When you repeatedly bring awareness to a task and redirect your focus, even when distracted, you reinforce clarity as a skill, not an accident. This is neuroplasticity in action. The brain changes based on where you place your attention and how consistently you train it. You don't get better at clarity by waiting for calm. You get better by building systems and habits that regulate your nervous system under pressure. Because real clarity isn't the absence of stress. It's the ability to remain focused in the middle of it. Clarity, then, is not something you wait for. It's something you practice. It emerges when your nervous system is finely tuned. Alert, but not anxious. Calm, but not sedated. You said, the state you're in determines the reality you perceive. Expand it up to minimum 600 words and do not add any ending sentence. We like to believe that we see the world objectively, that we interpret situations based on facts, logic, and reason. But that's not how perception works. The human brain is not a camera. It doesn't just record reality, it constructs it. And the lens through which that construction happens is your internal physiological state. In other words, the state you're in dictates the reality you experience. This isn't philosophy, it's neuroscience. Your brain is constantly interpreting signals from both your external environment and your internal body, what scientists call interoception. Interoception is your brain's mapping of your internal state, your heart rate, respiration, levels of CO2, blood sugar, inflammation, and more. These signals influence everything from your mood and behavior to your beliefs and decisions. That means your perception of the world is filtered, shaped, and colored by the state of your nervous system. When your body is in a heightened sympathetic state, your heart rate is elevated, your breathing is shallow, and stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are circulating, you experience a very different version of reality than when your nervous system is balanced. In this state, your brain prioritizes threat detection, it narrows your focus, it primes you for quick reactions, not deep reflection. You may misinterpret a neutral facial expression as threatening. You may perceive a minor challenge as insurmountable. You might feel urgency where there is none. This is not psychological weakness. It's biological design. In contrast, when you are in a parasympathetic state, calm but alert, your brain is more likely to access the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for higher order thinking, planning, and long-term decision-making. You have more access to empathy, patience, and nuance. You see more options. You interpret uncertainty not as danger, but as potential. Your internal state shifts your perceptual framework, what your brain highlights, what it ignores, and how it constructs meaning. Consider this. You've probably experienced days where everything feels chaotic. Nothing goes right, and even small inconveniences seem like major failures. And then other days you're in flow. You're focused, composed, and things just work, even when problems arise. The external world didn't change. Your state did. And that change altered your interpretation of events. This is not imagination. It's neurology. The reticular activating system, RES, in the brainstem plays a key role here. It acts as a filter. determining what sensory information gets through to the conscious brain. But it doesn't filter based on truth. It filters based on relevance to your current state. If you're in a state of high alert, your RAS tunes you into anything that signals danger, urgency, or conflict. If you're in a regulated, calm state, it lets in more creative, subtle, or non-threatening information. So the question isn't just what's happening around me, it's what is my nervous system allowing me to perceive. Even your memory is state dependent. This is called state dependent learning, a well-documented phenomenon in neuroscience. You are more likely to recall information, habits, or emotional associations that match your current physiological and emotional state. When you're stressed, your brain retrieves more negative memories. When you're calm, it accesses more balanced or positive memories. The implications here are profound. Your sense of identity, your beliefs, your truth, they're all shaped by what your brain considers relevant in the moment. And that relevance is determined by state. We also see this in visual perception. Under stress, your visual field narrows. This is called optic tunneling. You literally see less of the environment. Under calm states, your peripheral vision opens. You're able to take in more data. Again, same world, different input. You can't separate how you feel inside from what you perceive outside. The relationship is bidirectional. Your body sends signals to the brain, and your brain builds a version of reality based on those signals. That's why two people can be in the same situation and walk away with completely different interpretations. One person's nervous system was in a state of readiness and curiosity. The other's was in a state of defense and hypervigilance. They weren't just interpreting events differently, they were perceiving entirely different versions of the same moment. This is why training your internal state matters, because if you don't manage it, it will manage you. Your thoughts are not freeloading. They emerge from biology. What you call intuition or instinct often depends on your chemistry, your neuroendocrine profile, your autonomic tone, your blood sugar, your sleep, your breath rate. These physiological factors set the tone for the story your brain tells you about what's happening, what matters, and what's possible. And that story shapes everything you do next. Stress has been widely misunderstood. It's typically portrayed as something to be avoided, managed, or eliminated. But that perspective is incomplete and, in many cases, counterproductive. Stress isn't inherently negative. In fact, stress is an essential biological signal. And when understood properly, it can be harnessed into focused energy. The key lies not in avoiding stress, but in transforming it. Let's define what stress actually is. At the biological level, stress is the body's response to perceived challenge or threat. It activates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This system primes you for action. Your pupils dilate, heart rate accelerates, respiration increases, and glucose is released into your bloodstream. Simultaneously, hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol are secreted. These chemicals sharpen your attention, mobilize energy, and increase alertness. In evolutionary terms, this is adaptive. Stress allowed our ancestors to survive, but in the modern world, we often experience chronic or context-inappropriate stress, where the system stays activated far beyond the original trigger. The result is burnout, anxiety, and cognitive fatigue. But if you understand how to work with the stress response instead of fighting it, you can channel it into performance, clarity, and drive. Here's how it works. When stress arises, your brain shifts into a high-elected action radius state. Most people feel this as pressure, tightness, or mental noise. But beneath that surface, your body is delivering you a burst of usable energy. What determines whether that energy becomes panic or focus is your interpretation and your tools. Your prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning and conscious control, can override automatic fear responses if it's trained and supported by a regulated body. If you meet stress with awareness and structure, it becomes fuel. For example, just 60-90 seconds of deliberate calming breath, particularly using long exhalations, can shift your physiological state from high stress to high focus. This isn't just calming, it preserves the energy stress delivers while softening the unproductive edge. There's a difference between distress and eustress. Distress is uncontrolled stress where you feel overwhelmed, reactive, and fragmented. Eustress is productive stress, a temporary mobilization of your system toward a meaningful challenge. Eustress improves cognitive performance, strengthens memory encoding, and enhances neuroplasticity. In other words, the right kind of stress in the right dosage actually improves brain function. The difference between the two isn't the situation, it's the framing and the regulation. If you experience elevated heart rate and tell yourself, this is a signal that I'm overwhelmed, you spiral. But if you interpret that same elevated heart rate as, my body is mobilizing resources, I'm being prepared to perform, your mind aligns with that physiology. That cognitive reframe isn't psychological fluff. It actually changes which neural circuits get activated. It shifts blood flow in the brain. It redirects the stress cascade. You're training your brain to assign challenge to growth, not danger. Athletes do this, special forces operatives do this, high performers in any domain do this. They learn to work within the window of heightened arousal, using it to laser their attention, increase effort, and delay fatigue. But this requires calibration. If your stress system is constantly activated because of poor sleep, poor nutrition, digital overload, or unresolved trauma, then even small challenges push you over the edge. Your threshold drops. You react instead of respond. This is why recovery is as important as intensity. Nervous system training includes not just stress exposure, but also downregulation, sleep hygiene, non-sleep deep rest, cold exposure, breath protocols, and time in nature. These aren't luxuries, they are interventions that restore your baseline so you can engage stress when it matters most. Stress should be episodic, not chronic. A short burst of sympathetic activation paired with recovery creates a system that's resilient and adaptive. The real danger is not stress, it's the absence of oscillation. You want spikes and valleys, not a flat line. So when stress hits, the question isn't, how do I get rid of this? The question is, what will I do with the energy this stress is giving me? If you have tools, vision control, breath work, somatic awareness, environmental cues, you can reroute stress from chaos into focus. You can use it to initiate action, solve problems, and adapt under pressure. Stress becomes signal, signal becomes energy, energy becomes execution. That's not wishful thinking, that's physiology under your direction. The human brain is not a separate entity from the body. It's a tightly integrated bidirectional system, constantly exchanging signals with the organs, muscles, and sensory systems. And within this loop, two of the most powerful levers for directly influencing your mental state are breath and vision. These are not abstract practices. They are neurophysiological control mechanisms, grounded in hard science, capable of shifting your internal state in real time. Let's begin with breath. Breathing is unique in the body because it's both autonomic and voluntary. That means it happens automatically, but you can also control it. That's rare. Heart rate, digestion, blood pressure, these are mostly outside your conscious influence. But breath is a direct gateway, and it works both ways. Your mental state influences your breathing pattern, and your breathing pattern, in turn, feeds signals back to the brain about your level of safety, urgency, or calm. When you're anxious or stressed, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. This is a feature of the sympathetic fight or flight response. Your diaphragm constricts, breathing moves into the upper chest, and CO2 levels drop. This doesn't just reflect anxiety, it amplifies it. Fast breathing sends a signal to your brainstem that something is wrong. It creates a loop of rising tension. Now flip the script. When you slow your breathing, particularly with longer exhalations, you engage the parasympathetic nervous system, you calm the vagus nerve, you lower heart rate, you send a clear signal to your brain, I am safe. And that allows for increased access to the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for focus, reasoning, and cognitive control. There's a specific breath pattern that's been shown to rapidly downshift the nervous system. It's called the physiological sigh. 2 quick inhales through the nose, followed by a slow, extended exhale through the mouth. This pattern balances oxygen and carbon dioxide, releases tension in the diaphragm, and immediately reduces stress. It's not based on guesswork. It's backed by hard measurements of autonomic activity, blood chemistry, and neural output. Regular breath work, such as box breathing, inhale, hold, exhale, hold for equal counts, or cyclic sighing, can build your baseline resilience. It conditions your nervous system to return to balance more quickly after stress. This is what separates reactive individuals from adaptive ones. It's not that they don't feel stress. It's that they have built the capacity to recover and recenter using their own body. Now, let's move to vision. Vision is not just a tool for seeing the world. It's a regulator of your internal state. And that regulation starts in the retina, an extension of the brain. Visual input flows directly to brain regions involved in alertness, mood, and physiological arousal. The way you use your eyes literally changes your brain chemistry. When you're stressed, your visual field narrows. This is an ancient survival mechanism called optic tunneling. Your gaze locks forward and you lose awareness of the periphery. This sharpens attention for threat detection, but also increases sympathetic arousal. It makes you more reactive, more tunnel visioned, both literally and metaphorically. But you can reverse that. When you consciously widen your visual field, what's known as panoramic vision, you send a signal back to the brain that there is no immediate threat. This suppresses stress pathways and enhances parasympathetic tone. You can do this anytime. Simply relax your eyes and allow yourself to become aware of what's in your peripheral field without moving your head. You'll feel an almost immediate drop in internal tension. This shift isn't subtle. It's neurochemical. It changes your cortisol output, pupil diameter, and heart rate variability. There's also a direct relationship between gaze stability and cognitive focus. When your eyes dart around, your brain has to process more information, increasing cognitive load. But when you maintain a steady gaze, especially during tasks requiring focus, you reduce that load and allow the brain to prioritize depth over breadth. This is part of why meditation practices often emphasize soft gaze or single point concentration. It's not just spiritual, it's neurobiological. Combining breath and vision creates a powerful protocol. For example, before engaging in deep work or public speaking, you can perform 2 or 3 rounds of physiological sighs, followed by a moment of panoramic vision. This prepares the body and brain to enter a state of calm alertness, low in anxiety, high in focus. And that's the zone where clarity, creativity, and performance thrive. These tools are ancient in practice, but modern in explanation. They are hardwired into your biology, available to you at any moment. Without a device, without a therapist, without delay, you don't need to wait for clarity or calm to arrive. You can create them using systems you already possess. Breath and vision are not just passive sensory experiences. They are active inputs into the nervous system. In a way that sits in contrast to the number of systems that can move you from chaos into coherence. When we think of training, most people imagine physical movement, lifting weights, running drills, practicing a skill. But true training, especially for the nervous system, goes far deeper. It's not just about doing something over and over again. That's repetition. Training is something else. Training is repetition with intention. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. The brain and nervous system are highly plastic, meaning they can change in structure and function based on experience. This is the core principle of neuroplasticity. But neuroplasticity isn't passive. Your brain doesn't rewire just because you do something often. It rewires because of how intensely you focus, how emotionally charged the experience is, and how consciously engaged you are. Repetition creates the opportunity for change. Intention drives the change. Think about what happens when you learn to play a musical instrument. You don't just randomly press keys or strum strings and expect mastery. You break the task into parts. You repeat the scale, the chord, the movement, but you also focus on quality, timing, form, and feel. That focus is what causes the brain to recognize, reinforce, and optimize those neural circuits. Without that intention, it's just noise. The nervous system thrives on patterns, but it only reinforces those patterns when it perceives meaning, relevance, and effort. Repetition without presence can actually make things worse. If you rehearse distraction, that becomes your default. If you practice movement with poor posture, your body encodes dysfunction. If you revisit mental habits like rumination or reactivity, your brain lays down deeper pathways for stress. So when we say training, we mean more than just going through the